Hello students, now I will discuss how you can determine ammonium ion, copper 2 ion and iron 2 ion, iron 3 ion using by reacting with sodium hydroxide. These ammonium ion, copper 2 ion, iron 2 ion and iron 3 ion, these are cations. You know, cations is positive ion. Cations is positive ions. Cations is known as positive ions. All are positive ions, so these are cations. Cations. Please subscribe, like and share my channel. Let's move. Test for ammonium ion, NH4 plus ammonium ion, Cu2 plus copper 2 ion, Fe2 plus iron 2 ion and Fe3 plus iron 3 ion. Reagent is sodium hydroxide, NaOH, sodium hydroxide. Okay. Now first, ammonium ion. To a small amount of ammonium compound, sodium hydroxide solution is added. Ammonium compound means ammonium chloride or ammonium bromide, ammonium nitrate, ammonium phosphate, any ammonium compound. To a small amount of ammonium compound, sodium hydroxide is added and gently warmed, slightly heated. What happened? Ammonium compound reacts with sodium hydroxide to produce salt, ammonia plus water. 3 product. When ammonium compound reacts with sodium hydroxide to produce sodium chloride, ammonia and water. And you know, ammonia is a alkaline gas. So observation will be a gas is evolve means produce, which turns damp red litmus paper to blue. As you know, alkali turns damp red litmus paper to blue. So ammonia is a alkaline gas. This gas will turn damp red litmus paper to blue. So what you will do, at first you will take a boiling tube. You take some ammonium compound, say ammonium chloride. After that you will add sodium hydroxide, sodium hydroxide. Then if you give heat, after heating, salt plus ammonia plus water will be produced. On this gas, if you keep litmus paper, it turns to damp red litmus paper to blue. It turns to damp litmus paper, it turns to blue. Then a result. If you asking which gas is produced, ammonia gas is produced. If question is asking which ion present, you will write ammonium ion present. And if asking which compound, the compound will be ammonium compound. Here ammonium chloride is the ammonium compound. So you remember, to any ammonium compound, if you add sodium hydroxide, salt plus ammonia plus water will be produced. Ammonia will turns damp red litmus paper to blue, as ammonia is a alkaline gas. This ionic equation will be ammonium plus hydroxide to form ammonia plus water. This you can write aqueous ammonia, also aqueous water liquid. So ammonium chloride reacts with sodium hydroxide to produce salt, sodium chloride, ammonia and water. The ionic equation of this will be ammonium ion aqueous plus hydroxide ion aqueous to produce ammonia gas plus water liquid. This is main chemical equation. Second one is ionic equation. Now how you can test for Cu+2 ion? I will discuss how you can test for Cu+2 ion. Cu+2 ion. Cu2+ ion, Cu+2 ion. To a solution of test will be, to a solution of Cu+2 ion, sodium hydroxide solution is added. At first you will take a test tube, then Cu+2 ion you will take solid Cu+2 sulfate, solid. If you take water, it will dissolve and Cu+2 sulfate solution will form. To a solution of Cu+2 ion, first you will take a small amount of Cu+2 salt or Cu+2 compound, say Cu+2 sulfate, Cu+2 nitrate, Cu+2 chloride. Then adding distilled water you add, you will prepare solution. After that you add sodium hydroxide. Sodium hydroxide you will add. Then what you will observe, a blue precipitate is formed which is insoluble in excess sodium hydroxide solution. Means Cu+2 sulfate aqueous plus sodium hydroxide, copper hydroxide to form copper hydroxide solid. This is the blue precipitate. Here Cu+2 hydroxide is the blue precipitate. Then sodium takes sulfate, sodium sulfate aqueous. Copper sulfate, this also aqueous, AQ aqueous. Copper sulfate aqueous, sodium hydroxide aqueous, arrow or equal sign, you can give arrow, no problem. Cu+2 hydroxide solid, this is the solid mean precipitate, and sodium sulfate. This Cu+2 hydroxide precipitate is color is blue precipitate. So that's why observation will be a blue precipitate is formed which is insoluble in excess sodium hydroxide solution. Here Cu+2 ion result, Cu+2 ion present and blue precipitate. The formula of blue precipitate is Cu+2 hydroxide, CuOH whole to Cu+2 hydroxide. If you write ionic equation, that will be Cu+2 ion aqueous plus 2 hydroxide ion aqueous to produce Cu+2 hydroxide solid. This is main equation, this is ionic equation. Copper ion 2 plus aqueous plus 2 hydroxide ion aqueous to produce Cu+2 hydroxide blue precipitate. Copper 2 hydroxide is the blue precipitate. Now test for iron 2 ion Fe2 plus. How you can test for iron 2 ion using sodium hydroxide? So to a solution of iron 2 ion, or you can write a small amount of iron 2 compound is taken into a test tube, then adding distilled water, solution is prepared. How? At first you take a test tube, you will take a test tube, here you will take some iron 2 compound, say iron 2 sulfate. After adding water, this solution will be prepared. By adding distilled water, you will prepare solution. Then you add sodium hydroxide solution. Sodium hydroxide. After adding sodium hydroxide, you will see iron 2 hydroxide, pale green precipitate or green precipitate is formed, plus sodium sulfate salt. Iron takes hydroxide ion, iron 2 hydroxide, green precipitate is formed, plus sodium sulfate, aqueous. This also iron 2 sulfate also physical state will be aqueous. Here aqueous, iron 2 sulfate, aqueous, plus sodium hydroxide, aqueous. Iron takes hydroxide ion to form iron 2 hydroxide. This is the green precipitate. This is green. Iron 2 hydroxide is green PPT. PPT means precipitate. Green PPT. If you add which is insoluble in excess sodium hydroxide, this green precipitate does not dissolve on adding excess sodium hydroxide. Excess sodium hydroxide, no reaction. That means precipitate does not dissolve on adding excess sodium hydroxide. Now this is the ionic equation. Iron 2 ion aqueous reacts with hydroxide ion aqueous to produce iron 2 hydroxide solid. This is ionic form. So at first what you will do, you will take a test tube, take iron salt, solid iron salt, iron 2 compound. It may be iron 2 sulfate, it can be iron 2 chloride, iron 2 nitrate. Then you will add distilled water. After adding distilled water, you will prepare solution. Then you add aqueous sodium hydroxide, then you will see after adding sodium hydroxide, if you drop, you will see green precipitate, a green precipitate of FeOH2, iron 2 hydroxide is produced. If you add excess sodium hydroxide, this green precipitate does not dissolve, means no reaction. Precipitate does not dissolve, or precipitate is insoluble. You can write precipitate is insoluble. And ionic equation, iron 2 ion aqueous reacts with hydroxide ion to produce iron 2 hydroxide. So if you result which ion is present, you will write iron 2 ion is present. And green precipitate, what is the chemical formula of green precipitate? You write iron 2 hydroxide is green precipitate. You know, you have to learn it. FeOH2 is green precipitate. Now next, test for iron 3 ion. Iron, you know, iron, there are two oxidation state, one is iron 2, another is iron 3. As iron is a transition metal, so to a solution of iron 2 ion or to a solution of iron 2 salt or iron 2 compound, same reagent, sodium hydroxide solution is added. Then a red precipitate is formed which is insoluble in excess sodium hydroxide solution. I mean iron 3 chloride, this also will be aqueous, because to a solution you write to a solution, that means aqueous, iron 3 chloride. FeCl3 means iron 3 chloride, sodium hydroxide. Fe reacts with hydroxide ion to form iron 3 hydroxide plus sodium chloride. Iron 3 hydroxide is a red brown precipitate or brown precipitate, reddish brown precipitate you can write, plus sodium takes chlorine, sodium chloride aqueous salt is formed. This is FeOH whole 3. This is a red brown precipitate, reddish brown, red brown, brown, anyone you can write. So if you add excess sodium hydroxide to reddish brown precipitate, this reddish brown precipitate is insoluble or precipitate does not dissolve. So you have to remember iron 2 hydroxide green precipitate and iron 3 hydroxide brown precipitate do not dissolve in excess sodium hydroxide. That's why I write here no reaction. Now this is the ionic equation. Iron 3 ion aqueous reacts with hydroxide, I mean sodium hydroxide. Hydroxide come from sodium hydroxide to produce iron 3 hydroxide. This iron 3 hydroxide is the red brown or brown precipitate. So if what ions are present, you write iron 3 ion present, and this not green, this will be red brown, red PPT, brown PPT, red brown precipitate. PPT means precipitate is iron 3 hydroxide. So you know, you have to learn iron 2 hydroxide is green precipitate, green solid, and iron 3 hydroxide is red brown or brown precipitate. How you will do? At first you will take a test tube, then take some iron 3 compound or iron 3 salt. here solid salt. After that you add distilled water. If you shake, solution of iron 3 chloride or solution of iron 3 ion or solution of iron 3 compound will be prepared. After that you add a few drops of sodium hydroxide. After adding a few drops of sodium hydroxide, you will observe red brown precipitate is formed, FeOH3. If you add more excess sodium hydroxide, you also will observe red brown precipitate does not dissolve or red brown precipitate is insoluble. So this is the test for iron 3 ion. Now if you asking what ions are present, red brown precipitate, then you write the iron 3 ion present. What the chemical formula of iron red precipitate? You write FeOH3. Write the ionic equation when iron 3 salt reacts with sodium hydroxide, then you will have to write iron 3 ion aqueous plus 3 hydroxide ion aqueous to produce iron 3 hydroxide solid. So this is the 4 cations using sodium hydroxide. First, ammonium ion. To ammonium compound, here no solution is needed. Directly sodium hydroxide is added to ammonium compound. Ammonia gas is produced which turns damp red litmus paper to blue. Then copper 2 ion, iron 2 ion, iron 3 ion. You will have to prepare solution. How will solution? By adding distilled water to the salt, it will dissolve and solution will made. So to a solution of copper 2 ion, if you add sodium hydroxide, you would see blue precipitate is formed. To a solution of iron 2 ion, if you add sodium hydroxide, you will see green precipitate. To a solution of iron 3 ion, if you add sodium hydroxide, you will observe red brown precipitate or brown precipitate is formed. Precipitate means solid. And you have to know copper 2 hydroxide is blue precipitate. This blue precipitate does not dissolve on adding excess sodium hydroxide. Blue precipitate of copper 2 hydroxide does not dissolve in excess sodium hydroxide. And iron 2 ion produces iron 2 hydroxide green precipitate. Then this green precipitate does not dissolve on excess sodium hydroxide. I mean green precipitate is insoluble. Iron 3 ion produces sodium hydroxide to react with sodium hydroxide to produces iron 3 hydroxide FeOH3. This is the red brown precipitate, and this red brown precipitate or brown precipitate also insoluble or does not dissolve on excess sodium hydroxide. Hopefully you can understand. Okay, thank you dear students.